Hey, what's up VideoFort Nation? This is Don, and in this tutorial we are going to create a futuristic HUD element in After Effects using shape layers. Let's take a look.
Hey guys, Chris Carter, CEO of VideoFort here, and before we get into this awesome heads-up display tutorial by VideoFort Don, I just want to tell you two quick things about our sponsor of this video, Storyblocks. If you've never used Storyblocks before, you got to check them out. They're an awesome home for stock footage, After Effects templates, audio files, everything that you need to really complete your projects. If you haven't checked them out before, I just wanted to show you this really awesome feature. If you look in After Effects templates, for example, and if you become a member, you can have unlimited downloads of some really cool templates. All you have to do is click on the member library and it isolates every clip that you can get as part of the unlimited plan. From a footage perspective, they have a ton of really great footage that you can add to your projects that we use all the time, not only for client work, but for our YouTube videos and the like. So if you want to learn more about them, go to storyblocks.com/VideoFort to support us. Thanks guys. Now on to the tutorial.
So I will start our new graphic by creating this dashed circle here, and then I will use that as reference and just build outward. And I may skip certain parts or fast forward certain areas just so the tutorial isn't too long, but obviously I won't skip anything that's too important for you guys to be able to follow along. Okay, so let's start with that circle. I will go to my new comp and let's create a new shape layer. I'm gonna go to the mask icon over here and let's just get the ellipse tool. And if I bring back my title and action safe, I can try and find the exact center of the scene here, or the frame rather. And by the way, this is a new composition with these measurements, just 1080 by 1080, 29.97 FPS, which is the same as my footage. So just make sure you match that up as well. Okay, let's start drawing. If I just left click and drag out, I can also hold shift to make this a perfect circle, and also control to make it draw outward from the center, just like this. I'm gonna quickly reference the size of this original circle here, just so we can start at a similar scale. So that's this ellipse path. So its size is 225 units. I can open up this ellipse and let's see what the size is. It's 174, so let's make that 225 as well. Okay, from here on I would just kind of try and figure this out by just looking rather than copy the exact size. It would take too long otherwise. Okay, so to create the dashed effect is very simple. Go to the stroke and down here under dashes, you want to click the plus symbol, and you can't really see here because our UI is overlaying on top of our graphic. So if I press Shift, Control and H, that's going to make everything disappear, and now I can see just my drawn pixels. And I can change the number of dashes by controlling the dash size here. I'll set that to 5. I think that's fine, and that's it for that first element. So I will copy this and let's go to the contents. The ellipse here, I will go to the ellipse path and let's just make this larger. I'm going to take away the dashes this time, so just click the subtract symbol, and that's it for that element. I will make another copy and we'll go to ellipse number 1 again. This time we want this to be wider, so the stroke width, let's set this to 5, and if you look here, it's in these 4 sections. So the way I'm going to do this is by I could try to use dashes, but you know, so let's try that. If I just increase the number of dashes to roughly at a point where it looks like I have 4 segments, that actually works quite quickly and very easily. So you know what, that's how I'm gonna do it and move on to the next thing, which is basically the same, just a bit further out. So I will duplicate this layer again, and if I go into contents, we can expand the size of this. It also has a wider stroke. So if I go to stroke width, let's say something like 10, and I think that's relatively correct, maybe too much, but let's go with 10. And this time I cannot use the dashes, because even though they're quite quick and sometimes they will work just to use the dashes, it also creates an equal gap between all of the resulting separate dashed elements. If you look in this example, there is a small gap and then there's larger elements here. So here we need to do something different. So I am going to take away the dashes, and I'm going to add what's called a trim path. So if I go to add, let's go to trim path, or paths. I don't know how you are supposed to pronounce the plural of path, but there we are. Let's go in here and set the end to something other than 100%. So depending on how much you want to trim this, you just set that value. Let's say 20 as an example. We now want to clone these going around in a circle, and we want 4 of these. So there's another modifier you can add called a repeater. So let's get that. And by default, it just repeats your elements, you know, going to the right side over here. So let's go into the settings and change this. First of all, we need 4 elements, and then I need to go to the transform repeater, and their position is going to be reset to 0, which is just going to overlay those 4 copies on top of each other. But if we go to rotation, as I increase this, you will now see it wrap this around our circular shape here and create the exact type of shape we want. Now, the way this works is you have 360 degrees of rotation on a full circle. That's sort of the base unit, okay? So if you have 4 elements, then it means you need to divide that number, 360 divided by 4, and that's going to give you the right rotation number you need in order to have these spaced equally apart and create gaps which are the same size. So if I set this to 90, that's going to arrange these equally and give me these gaps which look the same. So this is perfect. Okay, moving on. There is what looks like another dotted line on the outside here. So, you know, this is going to be very simple. I can just take the original layer, and this time, all this time, I'm gonna just continue arranging, you know, in the right order. So if I duplicate number 1, I have to move it back up to the top. Okay, so if I go to contents, let's go to the ellipse path, increase the radius here, and also the stroke width. Let's go with something like 3. And I think that's about similar to what we are seeing here, maybe 4 even. I'm not sure. I think maybe the dashes could be smaller. So if I go to the dash settings, we can go for something like 10. And I think actually that's what we have here. Another dashed line on the outside. And I think we can use dashes again instead of a repeater setup. So let's go ahead and do that. Very straightforward here, nothing too difficult. But that's the beauty of shape layers. You know, you can just continue to arrange them, and even though each layer or each element is quite simple, when you combine everything together, you can create some very intricate looking shapes. So that's really awesome. I think here I just need to increase the dash size. So let's say something like this. And by the way, I am just looking at the resulting shape here to a point where, you know, I have roughly similar sized elements. Now, if at smaller dash sizes, this will be harder to spot, but at this larger size, I can tell that here, for example, I wouldn't want to have a value of 51 because it results in this one large element and then all these other ones are smaller. But if I keep going up, there's a certain point where it gives me elements which, you know, all sort of look the same. Now, there might be a slight difference. So, you know, but that's such a small difference, it's not an issue here. But that's one of the major differences of using dashes as opposed to actually using the repeater. With the repeater, you can be very precise in the number of clones, first of all, and also the spaces in between. But, you know, this works here just fine. So just use whatever you want and whatever is appropriate for that particular element. So for the next one, you can see here that, you know, we have this thick squares and the gaps in between them is much smaller. So this is clearly a repeater setup. So let's do that. If I jump into the contents of this layer, it needs to be a larger radius. First of all, the stroke needs to be wider. Let's say about 25. And I'm going to remove the dashes and add a trim path. And we're gonna go very small with this segment. I think 3%. Okay, maybe that's too small. Let's try 5 and see how that looks when we add a repeater. And again, we will go to the repeater options, and in the transform, we need to set the position to 0. And the rotation, now the trim path was set to 5. So 360 divided by 5. I'm not very good at math here, so I think that's 72 maybe, I don't know. I think I'm completely wrong. 360 divided by 5 gives us 72. Okay, I was right. That was very lucky, I was just guessing. But so if we go to the rotation, I can set that to 72. And actually, I forgot my own math here. That's not what we need. That's the number we would need if we only wanted 5 clones. We actually want a lot more than that. I'm gonna actually set my rotation here to be something a lot less, and then we can calculate based on that. Set to 20 degrees. Okay, I think this is how you do it. And I'm just forgetting my own math I explained earlier. If I do 360 divided by 20, that gives me 18. So with 18 copies of this, it's going to line up perfectly as you see there. Now, I think that may be less copies than you see here, but again, we're not trying to recreate the exact same thing, just something similar. Okay, moving on. The next element here is clearly another repeater setup. I won't talk through this next sort of 3 elements. They're all the same. The only major different one really is the inside of this here. So I will fast forward this section and we'll continue from there. So I've actually seen something which I should address before moving forward. Right now, all of this looks like it's perfectly aligned, but look at this. If I go to the repeater I'm currently working on, and I go to the rotation here and extend it past 90 degrees, and it's set to 90 because we only have 4 elements. you will see that it actually doesn't line up perfectly at the top here. This next line ends up cutting into the first one. And this is because this overall element is not actually in the perfect center of the scene. So we have to go back to the ellipse settings, and inside the transform ellipse, we need to make sure that our position here is set correctly. So there's a -2 right there. If I set that to 0, now you see everything lines up. Now it's a very small, subtle detail, but if there had been some animation on this and it was spinning around, you may have noticed a slight wobble or something because it wasn't perfectly in the center. So something to watch out for, and that's really something I should have checked on all of these elements at the very, very beginning. So now I almost have to go back and check all of them just to make sure that, you know, they're all lined up. And as you can see, the ellipse I have been copying all this time is actually slightly misaligned. But the great thing about all of this is each element is very, it's procedural. So when you just change one aspect of it, any modifiers you've added on top will still work just fine. And the whole shape is just going to update automatically. Anyway, so now everything's lined up, and I'm glad I made that mistake, because then you got to see how to quickly fix it. It's not really a big deal at all. Okay, we have now gotten to this element here, this slightly rounded rectangle, which is also in a circular pattern. And this wasn't just, you know, an ellipse spline with some modifications. We have to do this one a bit differently, but it follows a similar setup. So let me show you. If I create a new shape layer, we are going to draw a rectangle. So we can do this with the rectangle tool, and let's just draw something like this here. And I want to make sure, again, this is in the center or as close as possible to the center. If I hold Shift and then hold Control, that's going to draw out from the center just like we did earlier. Okay, then I want to go into the contents, and we need a repeater again. And if I go to the repeater options, let's go to the rotation. And if I just try to spin this, you can see it's not doing anything. We want this to, of course, spin around our entire shape here. So we need to go to the rectangle, go to its transform, and this time we want to offset the position. So we need to make this go all the way to where we want our resulting radius of this to reach. So this is going to be lined up on the outside of this dashed line. So that's where we need to place this right here. And now if we go back to the repeater and set its position to 0 and then change the rotation, you will now see it follow the correct path. Now, I don't remember how many of these I had in this example. And also you can see these are rectangles as opposed to squares, but we can fix all of that once we have the radius sorted. So if I go to rotation, let's set this to, let's say 10, which means I can have 36 copies, and that's going to line up perfectly. Okay, now I can deal with making this the correct shape. If I go back to the rectangle path, in the size, we can unlink the X from the Y. And now I can change just one of these, and it looks like it needs to be X. I'm going to go for a 2:1 ratio, or 1:2. So if I set this to 20, this here needs to be 40. So something like that. I think these elements are clearly larger than the ones I have here, but that's fine. Also, these are just a bit too far from this previous element, so to adjust the overall radius, remember we need to go back to the transform options of the rectangle and just lower that number, and it's all linked, so the repeater is not going to be broken, and now we have something like that. The next thing is creating the rounded corners. Now you could have drawn a rounded rectangle from the beginning, but you can also just go to this rectangle and change the roundness to be higher than 0, and as I do that you see the difference. Okay, so looking pretty good. Next up is just another ellipse. So again, I will skip the unimportant bits and we can move on to the next stuff. This set of elements here is a group of 3 things, and I've already created one of them, which is this stroke effect. But anyway, as I was saying, this is made up of 3 sections. You've got that stroke there, and then on the outside you've got these larger sections attached, and then the inside section right there. So this needs to be precise because I need to match this gap here with this other line. So I am going to use the repeater again. So if I just make a copy of this, let's start by, and I think I may have already made a copy, I'm not sure. Okay, I hadn't. Let's go to contents and trim this first of all, and bump the stroke up, maybe something like 15, or I guess even 20. We can go to the trim, set the end to just maybe about 15 or so, I'm not really sure. We can see what it looks like inside of a repeater, and then we can adjust that after. In the repeater settings, let's go to the position. This always needs to be at 0, and there are 4 elements, so our rotation is going to be 90, and let's have 4 elements. So now I can look at the size a bit different. It looks like the part which raises out is roughly the same as the part which is indented like that there. So let's try and match that up. I think that means an end on the trim here of about 12.5%, and I think that's about right. And the overall path here needs to be larger so that it raises out just like this here. I will make a copy of this whole thing, and let's go to the contents. I'm going to offset the rotation of this whole layer. So let's go to about here, just right up until the point it closes up the gap. So 45 degrees, and that just lined up nicely there. Okay, and in here we want to go to the ellipse, and let's put the stroke down to, let's say, something like 2. And I'm also going to trim the path a bit more. So if I go to the end, let's set this to 10%, and that means I have to rotate this whole thing. Now I've already rotated my layer, so maybe I could rotate the actual ellipse itself. So if I go into the transform ellipse settings, I can use that rotation value instead. And about 4 degrees seems to be correct, maybe 5, somewhere in there between, or is it 4.5, which is a 1/10 of the rotation of the layer, and those numbers seem to line up. Okay, so that's a nice detail there. The last thing is this element on the outside, and as you can imagine, we are just going to duplicate our current setup, in fact, I will do the previous layer, the thicker line. Let's duplicate that first. This is number 17, so let's rearrange so everything is in order. And we will make this larger up to about there. How many did we have? It looks like there are 8. So in the repeater options, let's have 8, which means that our trim path and rotation need to be adjusted. Starting with the rotation, it should be 360 divided by 8, which is 45. And then in the trim options, we can make it small enough until we have the correct spacing. And you can see they were quite close to each other. So I think 10 degrees is, or 10% on the trim there is perfect. I will make a copy of this, and this layer, or the one before that, let's set the opacity down to just 20. Re-enable the duplicate, but the stroke here is going to be a lot less. So let's say something like 2. Let's also trim this a bit more. I'm gonna go for 9%, or maybe even 8, but then move it inside of the outer layer, the outer larger layer. I will move the whole thing in the transform options here to be, I think, about 4% as well. And that lines up quite nicely. Okay, and that would be it. That is how you would combine all those various shape layers and different ways of setting up each layer, and you end up with something like this. And the great thing about this is it's procedural, and if you were to zoom into this and expand the whole thing, you are not going to lose any detail because it's made up of real shape layers in After Effects instead of, you know, some an image that you could have brought in where there's a finite number of pixels. In which case, if you were, you know, playing around with the sizing and scale, you would lose some detail. But here I can expand this as high as I want or make it as small as I want, and I maintain 100% sharpness. Okay, so there is one more group of elements which I didn't do just now, and that is this target or reticule shape in the middle. I'm not going to go over the step-by-step for this because using what you've learned up to this point, this is very easy to do. So this is just a circular ellipse with a stroke. These 4 sections are the same thing, but inside of a repeater and trim setup, and then again, same thing on the outside. So you can use that knowledge to create this element yourself. What I am going to do is just copy this and bring it into our new graphic, and you can see that it just lines up nicely like so. Okay, you'll see that this element is also animated, and there was no actual keyframes in this. I just used an expression on all of the various layers. You will also see that certain elements are moving together. So, you know, like these 2 on the outside, this whole section here is moving together. So I want to just group certain things together and do it in a way that makes sense. If we go back to the new one, you will see that this center element is already grouped together. And the way I did this was by just taking the 2 elements on the outside and making them a child of the first element. And I'm gonna press Shift Control and H here so you can see my overlay. And if I press R for rotation, I can spin this around and you see they all move together. The expression I used on this is very simple. If I press E twice, just double tap, it's going to open up the expression that I used here, and it's wiggle, open bracket, 0.1, comma, 180, and I attached this to the rotation. So the way you do this is by opening up the rotation. Let's see which element this is here. So these two need to be attached. So I'm going to take number 18 and make it a child of number 17. And these are a blue layer. So just to keep everything organized and easy to identify, I make sure that the next set of elements are a different color in their layers here. So these three need to be all one thing. So if I take 16 and 15, make them a child of number 14, I can then take all three and change their color to anything else that's different. So let's say red, and I'm just going to alternate between those two colors for all the elements which I want to be in the same group. And also creating a parent-child relationship between the elements I want to move at the same time. And then once everything is organized, I can now apply that expression. So again, if I go back to the rotation of shape layer 17 here, which is this outer section, it's carrying the layer above it, so I only need to apply it to this layer. If I hold AOT on my keyboard or the Alt key and click the keyframe, I can paste that same expression. And all this expression means, by the way, is 0.1 times every second, the rotation is going to be randomized by 180 degrees, or within that range. If you want this to be faster, you can change the 0.1 to a higher number. So let's say 0.2, and everything would happen twice as fast. Or you could also change the range. So I could go for 360, which means it's still moving the same amount of times a second, but it's having to travel further, so it's going to appear faster. So either way, you can just set that up to be anything you want. Another expression you could also do is just a simple rotation, moving in one direction or the other. And instead of using wiggle, you would use a time expression. So if I go to this shape layer number 14, I can click the keyframe and type out time times, let's say 20, which means it looks at the time in your timeline and multiplies it by 20. And as the time moves on, that element will move as well. So very quickly you can start to have some animation. But I quite liked the continuous random movement, so that's the expression I used on all of these elements. So after applying the same expression to everything, I can just zoom out here, and let's preview this without any overlays. So if I just press space, this is the animation I have created. Now, of course, you can always use keyframes if you want some very specific type of animation. That's entirely up to you. Now, at this point, you can do some stuff like add your own colors to the different elements just to make it look a bit more interesting. Here is an example where I colored some of the elements red just to give you an idea of what that can look like. But that would be it for this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.